first speaker is Dr. Baruch Barzel. Dr. Baruch Barzel is a faculty member in the Department of Mathematics here at Bar-Ilan University. His research focuses on the dynamic behavior of complex networks, uncovering universal principles that govern the dynamics of the systems, such as disease spreading, gene regulatory networks, and population dynamics. Among his prizes, he received last year the Creel Prize for Excellence in Scientific Research. And Baruch, you may start.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Dana, for this introduction. I also need to thank Yossi from Bar-Ilan University for making all of this happen, and thank you guys for joining us. This is a challenging time, especially for people who like to meet face-to-face and like to share as a community, but fortunately we have the technology to keep the community living even throughout this period, and hopefully you will get to meet each and every one of you face-to-face in the near future. So yesterday, you've been learning a lot about the structure of complex networks. Network science, it's approximately a 20-year-old science, and for the past 20 years, we have been doing a pretty good job at mapping all of these complex systems. However, despite the fact that we now have a pretty good grip on the structure of systems, the real question that we need to leverage it into now is understanding their dynamic behavior. And you see, I like to see in my lab the network as a roadmap. And this roadmap, sorry for a second, I got a bit into technical challenge here. I like to see the network structure as a roadmap. It tells you which junctions are connected to which other junctions, what roads link between different nodes in the system. But we all know that the exact same roadmap can have very different traffic patterns at 8 a.m. in the morning and at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Now, this is, of course, just a metaphor, but the idea behind this metaphor is the notion that similar structures, the road did not change between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. Similar network structures can lead to profoundly different dynamic behaviors. So we have been studying the structure of networks for 20 years. How can we leverage that to understand what will be their actual dynamic behavior? And of course, to achieve this, we need to add another layer of description. So the idea now, if you talk about dynamics, is that our network is a link between nodes. But the other layer of description is asking the following question. If I draw an edge between two nodes, what does that edge really mean? Because once we reduce things into a network structure, an ecological network, a social network, a technological network, or a biological network, they all look the same. They're nodes connected by links. But what is the meaning of that link? When I connect node A to node B, does that mean that node A pollinates node B, consumes node B, or maybe node A infects node B with a virus? So those are different interaction mechanisms, and we need to add them into our description of the complex system behavior. So the idea is to say that every node has a dynamic activity, xi of t. The meaning of this activity depends on context. It can be the abundance of a species in an ecosystem, the probability of infection of an individual, or the concentration of a protein in a biological network. So xi of t is the dynamic activity of node I. And when we track the behavior in time of these dynamic activities, they're driven by what we call the general dynamic equation. The first term, m0, you see here in red, the first term, m0, captures the self-dynamic of every node. If I put a node in the middle of the room, absent any interactions, what is that node going to do? Is it going to degrade? Is it going to reproduce? If it's, for instance, an infected person, it will probably recover. So that's the self-dynamics without taking into account the network interactions. And then the sum here on the right actually sums over all the interactions between the node and its nearest neighbors. So in this description, the blue term, Aij, is our network, our weighted, directed network topology, everything we have been focusing on throughout the course yesterday. And the functions M0, M1, and M2, they capture the nonlinear interaction mechanisms. They are the place where we differentiate whether this network is a network of plants and pollinators, a network of individuals infecting one another, or a network of proteins chemically binding to one another. And the one important thing to understand here is that while Aij, the network structure, may change, may be altered, we can for now practice social distancing, so we're disintegrating the social network in a sense, the dynamics, M0, M1, and M2, are intrinsic. They are in the physics of the system. They tell you how your components interact. Human beings can infect each other with viruses but they cannot pollinate it. Okay, they can pollinate each other, but it's a different story. But they cannot chemically bind to one another. So the mechanisms are intrinsic to the physics of the system. Now let's make this come to life. There are many, many different dynamic models that people use that fall into this category. For instance, here is an example, and for people with a little bit of experience with nonlinear dynamics, you might have encountered at least one of these examples. Here's an example of a common model used in ecological networks. You might be familiar with the first term. The self-dynamics is what is called logistic growth. It grows by reproduction until you reach a saturation because of the lack of resources. Here is a common model for gene regulation, and perhaps the most relevant model nowadays is this one. This is like the Ising model of network science. It's the classic model for epidemic spreading. I don't want to explain every detail here, but since this is so relevant, let's talk a little bit about what the mechanisms that are involved here. This is the most basic model for epidemic spreading. We have more complicated models to use too, okay? But it basically says the self-dynamics is just recovery. If a person is infected and he's in isolation and has no interactions, he's going to recover, or unfortunately might die. But in any way, he's going to stop infecting other people. The second term captures the process of infection. And infection has to have, first of all, an interaction, that's AIJ. Second of all, you have to have an infected individual, XJ, that represents the probability that your friend is infected. But you, in order to contract the virus, have to be healthy. And if XI is the probability of you being infected, 1 minus XI is the probability of an individual being healthy. So that's a classic SIS model, which everyone, people run a little bit more complicated models now, but everyone is interested in the behavior of this model on a social network. Now, why is this challenging? So if you're a physicist, this will make a lot of sense to you. And for those of you who are not physicists, it'll also make a lot of sense to you, only in a little bit of a less mathematical sense. You see, in physics, we deal with this all the time because the way we view our nodes here is they're like interacting particles. But the thing is that physics is used to putting interacting particles on a very structured and symmetric lattice. The networks in physics typically look like that. They're low dimensional. It could be 2 or 3 dimensional lattice. They're very symmetric. Every node, for instance, sees the exact same environment. Maybe it's a little bit noisy. Maybe the lattice is not perfect, but that's the mental picture that we typically have in mind. Our systems are disordered. They're weighted. They're very heterogeneous, so you don't have that symmetry where every node sees the same environment. In fact, as you learned yesterday, the degrees of nodes in many real networks are scale-free, so they can span orders of magnitude. And to that, we've just added another challenge, and that is the fact that while the dynamics in particle systems are driven by the classic laws of physics, the dynamics in our systems are diverse and nonlinear and can really take on many different forms. So with this in mind, I would like to talk about the peculiar behaviors that this leads to. For instance, in August of 2003, a local failure in South Canada, right here, where you still see the lights are on, propagated to become one of the largest blackouts in history. For our listeners from India, I've learned that the largest blackout in history was actually in India, and it was 10 times larger than this one. But in any case, this is a very rare, unexpected behavior, but it's not just about power systems, it's about networks in general. So we need to understand how the structure of our critical infrastructure leads to its resilience, how the structure of our neuronal or biological networks lead to their resilience, or how the social network can transition between a state where everyone can interact with one another, and all of a sudden, we see this viral spread that completely disintegrates the functionality of the system. And the idea is that 99% of the time, and I think this is part of what Reuven taught you yesterday, 99% of the time, these systems are extremely functional. They're extremely robust and resilient to the stress that they're subject to. There are always failures in the power system, but large blackouts are rare. There are always local outbreaks of epidemics, but large global pandemics are rare. We see this also in ecological systems. This is a coral reef. You subject it to stress and it survives, but then at some point it collapses. And when it does collapse, it does so in a rather unexpected and abrupt fashion. But now that we've added dynamics, we can actually talk about resilience in a little bit of a more subtle way than the way we treated it until now. It's not just about the structural integrity of the network. This tree, which is subject to stress, may not break, but still lose a lot of its functionality because it's under stress. So now we can talk about the dynamic resilience of a system, where the system might still be might still preserve its structural integrity, but lose some aspects of its functionality. And to do that, let's dive into the math and go back to what I called before the physicist's comfort zone. Let's start with a one-dimensional description of resilience, a very simple description which is well mapped and well understood mathematically. And then once we have the tools for a one-dimensional system, we'll try to dive into what happens in the environment of a complex network. So let's imagine a one-dimensional system. Just to make it concrete, let's say that it's an ecosystem, okay? And the ecosystem is driven, it has a dynamic activity, which in this case represents, for instance, the biodiversity or the average abundance of all the species in the system. However, it is subject to some level of stress because of global warming, because of pollution, because of ocean acidity, whatever that comes into the picture stresses the system. So most generally, the activity of the system, X, follows some general dynamic equation. I don't know exactly what the structure of this equation is, but this equation is some function of the current state of the system. And of course, it has this parameter, which we call the stress parameter, beta. And to solve this, what we're looking is for a steady state. The system needs to reside at some stable fixed point of this equation, which means it has to follow two rules. First thing is that the function f beta x equals 0. When this function equals 0, then this derivative is 0, and the system is not going to nudge, not left or right. It's going to stay at its location because the time derivative is exactly balanced. It's 0. But that's not enough because we can put fixed points up here or down here. Obviously, the one here on the bottom, and this is a metaphor, represents a stable fixed point. If you nudge the system a little bit, it will always bounce back to its original state. On the other hand, if you put the system on the top of the hill, that is, mathematically speaking, a fixed point, but it's like balancing something on your finger. Every small nudge to the left or to the right is going to push the system away. So that's an unstable fixed point. And the way to make sure that you are at the bottom of the well and not at the top of the hill is to demand that the f dx is smaller than 0. Those two conditions mean that the system doesn't just reside at a fixed point, but at a stable fixed point. And these two conditions, once we solve them, tell us what are the possible states of the system. They give us x, the state of the system, as a function of beta. And this gives us a very clear solution. As you stress the system, what will be the system state? So this is what we call the resilience function. And I want to read now the resilience function and try to extract what might be interesting in this function. This is called an S-curve. That's not the only possible shape. That's just an example. But let's see what this example can teach us. So the first thing is to go to the limit of low beta. Low beta represents a state where the system is under very low stress. And as you can see, its state is up here. If it represents species abundance, this is the happy state, the desirable state where all the animals are affluent and abundant, and we don't see a lot of extinctions, and everything is good in our system. So this is a desirable state. But it's also a resilient state. Why do we say that? Because this is the only solution under low beta. And the fact that it is the only solution means that no matter how much I kick the system and perturb it and change it, it's going to always bounce back. It has no choice because the function will lead it back to the only possible solution. So fluctuations are temporary. They're not there to stay. On the other hand, if we increase the stress to very extreme limits, for very large stress, the system cannot reside anymore in the happy state. It inevitably collapses to the undesirable state. In the context of an ecosystem, this can represent a mass extinction, a sharp drop in biodiversity. But here's the interesting point. What happens here in the middle? Well, that's a very subtle point, because if I observe the state of the system here in the middle, I might not see anything dramatic happening. You see, the system was very biodiverse and abundant. Everything was happy. As I increase the stress, of course, the species kind of reproduced a little bit less. So we see a little bit of a smaller activity, but we don't see anything dramatic happening. Nothing like the collapse we see over here. But the truth is that behind the scenes, even though we do not see it, something dramatic did happen. Because up here, we only had one fixed point. And once we cross this orange line here, we suddenly have two potential states of the system. And if the system undergoes a sufficiently large perturbation, it might not bounce back. It might revert to the undesirable bottom state. So the system remains functional, but it lost its resilience. It lost its ability to bounce back from a very large perturbation. And so here is how to read into this, because this was a crash course on one-dimensional nonlinear systems, but here are the important takeaways, okay? So if you lost me somewhere along the way until now, this is a great place to join back, okay? The resilience function has two critical transitions. Of course, they are the ones that we want to know. This transition is dramatic, the system collapses. This transition is much more subtle, and if we didn't know math, we might not be able to observe that anything happened in the system. But those two transitions represent a critical loss of the system resilience. But here's the point, you see? When I constructed the system, there were two functions here. One is f, which I highlighted now. The function f represents the physics of the system. You cannot change that. Corals and fishes will do what corals and fishes do. Bees and flowers will do what bees and flowers do. Humans will interact the way humans interact. That's the physics of the system. You cannot change that. It's God-given. On the other hand, the parameter beta, that's a tunable parameter. That's under your control. You can create more social distancing or less social distancing. You can increase pollution or decrease pollution. You can increase the load on the power system or decrease the load on the power system. So what does each of these parameters determine? The resilience function, the black function here, and its critical transition points, beta 1 and beta 2, those are a characteristic of F. If you go to the supermarket and you buy a system, you purchased with that system, you open the package, it comes with a resilience function. The resilience function is intrinsic to the system. You have no control over that. On the other hand, the specific state of the system, X, well, that is very, very diverse. That really depends on the tunable parameter beta. So the resilience function is a characteristic of your system, but where you are on this function, are you in the desirable or the undesirable state? Well, that is determined by a tunable parameter that you can change and perturb, which we call beta. The classic analogy is the phase diagram. So imagine you put a kettle on the stove and you start heating up the water. So when we know that there's a critical temperature, just like there's a critical stress, if you want, where the system transitions from liquid to gas, that's at 100 degrees. Okay, so if I look at different kettles, they're going to be very different states. Some of them are boiling, some of them are cold, some of them are already vaporized. So the specific state would be very different among different kettles. But the phase diagram is the same everywhere. So the phase diagram is a characteristic of the water. Your specific location on the phase diagram, well, that depends on the tunable parameter temperature. Okay, so now that we know how to read resilience functions, we understand that this is the one thing we want to do, right? So once you go to the supermarket and purchase a complex system, the first thing you want to look at is open the manual and look at the resilience function of that system. So you understand what buttons to push, what are the critical points, where it's going to collapse, where it's going to lose resilience, and so on. So the classic example that we discussed was an S-curve resilience function, and the classic analogy for that would be, for instance, an ecosystem. So we have a mass extinction here and a loss of resilience here, but there are other types of diagrams, and once you get these diagrams, these functions, you understand a lot about the way your system behaves. For instance, here's another classic example. Often arises in models of genetic interactions. We're going to see that later on. Okay, the system has two states: the live state, where all the genes are active and everything is good, and you start subjecting them to stress, like you deprive them of nutrition, or you heat them up, or you start removing genes one by one, but you start subjecting the cell to some stress. And at some point, its functionality starts to decline, but at some point, there's an abrupt transition and the cell just dies. And here is the important thing. You see, the live state is stable under certain conditions. The dead state is always stable, which means that this is an irreversible process, right? You start stressing the cell. At some point, you reach the critical stress and it dies. Then you say, okay, I'll reverse it. I'll return the nutrition. I'll pour glucose over you. I'll lower the temperature. I'll remove the acid. I will remove the stress. but this state is always stable, so it just remains there. Okay, so that's like a classic irreversible process like cell death. Here's another one used for power collapse. I'm not going to go into it right now, okay, too much details for an online presentation, but the idea is that once you know what your resilience function looks like, you understand a lot about how your system behaves, and the most important part, of course, is to be able to predict these critical transition points where something crucial happens to the system. So up until now, we were talking about one-dimensional systems, and everything seemed nice and solvable. The problem is that our systems, the ones that we're looking at, social systems, technological systems, biological systems, they're not one-dimensional. They are, in fact, a whole set of n nodes driven by potentially n squared different interactions, and they can undergo a whole set of perturbations. You can perturb the system in many different ways. You can change each of these weights of the links, you can remove links, you can remove nodes. So your parameter, what was up until now just a single number beta, is now an n squared dimensional matrix of interactions. And of course, instead of having a simple resilience function, you're going to have a multi-dimensional, okay, don't leave us right now, I'm going to say a very mathematical word. You're going to have a multi-dimensional resilience manifold. Okay, I drew it here in 3 dimensions because that's the best I can do. But of course, it's not 3-dimensional. If you have 1,000 nodes, it's 1,000 squared dimensional. So obviously, it's going to be much more difficult to solve. But let's go back to our modeling framework. Our modeling framework doesn't look at all the different systems you can consider, only systems that fit within this structure. I remind you, AIJ, the blue term, represents the network structure. It's a weighted network, and most important, that's not intrinsic to the system. It is subject to perturbation. Take the social network, you can distance yourself or get closer. You can gather together or not gather together. Okay, you can increase the temperature and make the animals run slower and then be more vulnerable or not. Okay, so the weighted network is subject to perturbation through node deletion, that's extinction. You can add links or remove links or change weights. That's your network. That's not intrinsic to the system. On the other hand, the orange terms, M0, M1, and M2, they're the dynamic mechanisms. They capture the physics of the components. Is it people infecting one another or animals pollinating one another? 2 different types of mechanisms. And with this in mind, let's just be phenomenological. I want to start looking at an example. And from this example, we'll see how we generally predict the resilience of systems within this family. So our first example would be an ecological system. Why an ecological system and not a social system subject to a pandemic? Well, because when we wrote that paper, there was no pandemic in the world. So that seemed to be the most relevant system to talk about. It's a plant pollinator network. I'm not going to go into the details, but what you need to see here is that the dynamics is very, very nonlinear. Very, very complicated, and I'll add one more thing. We didn't invent this dynamics. This is one of the commonly used models to model plant pollinator interactions. Some of the things might look familiar. This, for instance, is logistic growth, which you already know. This is something called the alley effect. It means that you benefit from some tribe, from the fact that you have a beehive. Okay, you benefit from your friends. It's not just about competition. It's not just a lose-lose situation. It's also a win-win situation. And this term captures the potential symbiotic interaction where a plant helps, it aids the prosperity of the pollinator. You do not need to understand all the details of this equation. So if this equation looks a little bit convoluted to you, that's fine, okay? But what we did is we started modeling the states of this system while subjecting the system gradually to stress. How can we stress the system? For instance, we can start making plants go extinct by removing a node. Or we can make a pollinator go extinct by removing a pollinator node. Or we can just completely change the environment. As I said, you increase the temperature and the bees start flying a little bit slower and they pollinate the plants a little bit at a slower rate. So you change the weights. Of course, we don't know how to do that. So we just change them at random. Those are random perturbations that we apply to the system. And what we expect to find is that the system is functional until you reach some critical stress and then it collapses. And the truth is that we do find that, but it doesn't look at all as clean as the pictures you see here. this is what it actually looks like. This is a real ecological network that was mapped. We didn't map it. It was mapped already, okay, upon which we ran this dynamics. And as you can see, as we start making plants go extinct, at some point, the good state of the system collapses down to the bad state. This, like the cloud, is the positive, diverse, biodiverse state, and down here is the mass extinct state. But the crucial point is that the point of collapse is very unpredictable. It happens at very different locations depending on the realization. So every time we run this experiment again, because we maybe made this go extinct before that, or this before that, every time we ran this experiment, we got a different result on the crucial point of collapse. Remember, all the kettles, they boil at 100 degrees, but all the ecosystems, they don't collapse at the same point. So we don't get a universal resilience curve as we expected. We get something very diverse. This is one system, and we did this for 13 different systems. And here's what you get. Now you're saying, I'm looking at this, and this is a whole mess. Well, if that is what you're saying, then you're right. That's exactly the point. It is a whole mess. But for those of you who still don't see the mess, let me help you out here by focusing on several specific examples. Every one of these rows represents a different ecosystem. And every one of the columns represents a different form of perturbation, either making pollinators go extinct, making plants go extinct, or just changing the weights. And for instance, when we do this we do the same perturbation on different networks, we get very different outcomes. Some of these systems are extremely resilient. You can remove 95% of the pollinators, but still the remaining 5% continue to thrive. On the other hand, other systems are very sensitive. Sometimes you just remove 10% of pollinators and the system already collapses. We also see differences within the same system, but subject to different perturbations. This system, for instance, is very resilient against plant extinction, but once we do pollinator extinction, it sometimes collapses at a very early state. So it's very unpredictable. But maybe the most troubling outcome is that even if we look at the same system and at the same type of perturbation, we still see very diverse results on different realizations. So this is the same network and it's subject to the same kind of perturbation. Sometimes it's very resilient. It can suffer 97% removal, but still function. And in other cases, already after 25% of removal of nodes, it collapses. So what we find is a very diverse picture. And the reason is very clear, because in the one-dimensional system, we had just a resilience function. In the multi-dimensional system, we have a resilience manifold. And in a resilience manifold, every realization, I need you to use your imagination a little bit now, every realization is a different cross-section in that manifold. And because the manifold is complicated and multidimensional, every realization looks a little bit different. Not only in terms of the specific numbers, but even in terms of the abrupt collapse, the phase transition itself, the big picture. So what's the problem? The problem is that we have a multidimensional system, but we only have a solution for a one-dimensional system. So we need to reduce our system from a multidimensional system to a one-dimensional system. And the way to do that in physics is to seek symmetry. Once you have symmetry, you can reduce a very complex system into something which is low-dimensional. So we are seeking a dimension reduction. And for that, we need to find the natural symmetry for our systems. Now, here's the classic trade-off in physics. You see, this description that we started with is very accurate, but way too detailed for us to actually advance mathematically. We want to find a model that somewhere balances between being too simplistic on the one hand, but too detailed on the other hand. So the naive approach when you need to do dimensional reduction is to say, let's talk about the average. Instead of talking about the whole network, let's talk about the behavior of the average node. So instead of talking about Aij and n by n structure, a big matrix, let's talk about the average degree, which characterizes the neighborhood of the average node. Instead of talking about xi, the activity of every single species or every single node in our system, let's talk about the average activity, x average. Averaging, people don't think about it this way usually, but averaging is actually an argument of symmetry. Why? Because when I look at the average node, for instance, I am assuming that it captures the typical node in the system. Basically, I'm assuming that the nodes are not too different from one another, so that I can capture them by one number, which is the average. So averaging is an assumption of symmetry that all nodes are, in a sense, similar to one another. But if you've tuned in yesterday to all the talks, you know that that's not the case. People are rather similar to one another. That's why, despite the fact that some of us are larger or smaller, we can all sit on the same chairs. But nodes in the network are typically scale-free. They are very heterogeneous. They're not similar at all. And there are hops that can be 100 or 1,000 times more connected than the average. That's like meeting a person that's 2 kilometers tall. Now, where's she going to sit? What kind of chair do we need to construct for her? So chairs are tailored for the average person. But averaging is just not the right way to go on networks because there is no average in a scale-free network. So we go back to the equation and we ask the equation, what is the symmetry that you do have? And the equation does have a symmetry. You see, this term here is the interaction term. I apologize, it's a little bit different. I stated it earlier as M1 times M2 and here as Q. There's a very important reason for that, and that is the fact that I'm a human being and I make mistakes, okay? So forget about that small detail. But the important point is this. The state of each node in the system is fully determined once we know the state of its neighbors. This is important. In a network environment, the only information that any node has to the fact that there was a perturbation, that this guy became extinct, and that link became removed, and there was some change in parameters somewhere else in the network, the only way you can get information in the network is through your network neighborhood. The information is conveyed to you through your neighbors. And therefore, once I know the state of each node's neighbors, that determines the state of that node. And here's the point. And we'll cover this point in several layers. We'll start with the simplest layer. Nodes are extremely heterogeneous, but neighborhoods are much more symmetric. Let me try to motivate that. When I look at a node, I pick a specific node and ask that node, what's your degree? I'm going to get very different answers. Why? Because nodes are scale-free and extremely heterogeneous. But when I look at a neighborhood, I pick a node and I ask it, what's the average degree of all your neighbors? That's not a single node anymore. The degree of the neighbors is a sample of nodes. It's an averaging over a set of nodes. If that node is a hub and it has 100 neighbors, then I just took a sample of 100 neighbors and looked at its degree. And the point is that because neighborhoods are samples, they are much more symmetric than individual nodes. So while nodes are heterogeneous, neighborhoods are much more symmetric. Fortunately for us, neighborhoods are also what is important because the state of a node is completely determined by its neighborhood. So therefore, while looking at the naive average was too simplistic, what we can do is look at the average neighborhood of a node. There's a way in linear algebra to write that down, but your take-home message is that our beta now is not the average degree. It's a weighted average over the degree of a node's nearest neighbors, and X effective is not the average activity, but a weighted average over the activities of a node's nearest neighbors. So here is the strategy. The strategy is do not write a direct equation for the average neighbor. Write a direct equation for, here's the strategy. Do not write a direct equation for the average node. Write a direct equation for the average neighbor of that node. Now, some of you are now listening to me and saying, what in the world is the difference? This is a node, and the neighbor is also a node. So what's the difference between averaging over neighbors or and averaging over nodes? Okay, I want you to suspend your disbelief for a second, because there is a difference between these two processes, and it has some very interesting implications. But first of all, let's look at the results of doing that and convince ourselves that it works. And then let's go back to the question, why is it so different to average over nodes versus averaging over neighbors? So let's look at the results. Remember this? This represents the diversity, the lack of universality, the inability to predict the ecological collapse. Well, if we write the equation for the single variable, which is the nearest neighbor, we reduce the system to one parameter, beta effective, the average neighborhood, another parameter, X effective, the average activity, And every time we run a perturbation on the node, on the system, we remove links or remove nodes, we look at how this perturbation impacted the average neighborhood. We can do that, and we can analytically find that the resilience function should look something like this. This is the S-curve that we've seen before, only on log scale. So it bends around in the negative, and we don't see that. Okay? It captures a system with two potential states. One state, which is here, under low stress, which is always stable. And as you increase the stress, you get two states. And one of them is the good state, where the system is functional, and the other one is the mass extinct state, where the system collapses. Here's what we expect. If what we're saying is true, then all of the diversity you see in the background of the slide is simply because we have not been looking at the system through the right lens. We've been looking at how many pollinators we have been removing or how many plants. We haven't been looking at how we have been changing the parameter beta effective. If this is true, then all of the data you see in the background should actually be captured by this analytically predictable function. And what we do is exactly that. We map the whole system into beta space, and what you see here is everything that you've seen in the background. Okay, so all the data you see in the background collapse into a single universal curve. So beta space exposes that what seemed to be diverse and unpredictable actually has a universal resilience function. What's the trick? The trick is to look at it through the right parameter. It's not about how many pollinators you removed. It's about how you impacted the parameter beta effective. I'll give you an analogy to understand that in a couple of slides. But first of all, I have a debt, right? I need to convince you that averaging over neighbors really is different than averaging over nodes. And here's the trick. See, when we look at the average degree of a node, here is the experiment we're doing. Average node means you choose a node at random. You ask that node, how many friends do you have? It gives you an answer. For instance, this guy here will give me the answer 5. This guy here will give me the answer 1. And then I do this many, many times, repeat. I repeat this many, many times until I get the average degree of a node. What does it mean to look at the average friend? You choose a node at random. You don't ask that node, what's your degree? You ask that node, who's your friend? And then you ask that friend, how many friends do you have? And you repeat this process. Well, the second process is very different, and I need you concentrated here because this is confusing, okay? The black node here is only 1 friend, and the orange node here has 5 friends. When I look at the average node, I sample nodes at random. These two people have the same probability of being sampled. But when I look at the average neighbor, I'm doing a different thing. You see, in order to select this one here as an average friend, there's only one option. I need to choose his only friend and hope that that friend will point at him. So the probability of this guy coming up in my sample is actually pretty low. On the other hand, if I look at the orange person here, he has 5 friends that can potentially point to him as their friend. So he's going to be much more frequently sampled when I look at the average friend. And the message is this: the average neighbor is profoundly different than the average node, especially in the presence of hubs, which have a much higher probability of going up in the sampling process. Okay, that's one thing. And the second thing, and this is important, and it's also very relevant for the current situation that the world is in, it's not about the nodes, it's about the neighborhoods. It's not about you, it's about your network environment. It's all, the state of the system is all about who is surrounding you and not about who you are. Okay, so this is the one thing that we do here. We average over friends instead of averaging simply over nodes. Let me put a side note. This has many corollaries. So it means that your friends are on average more popular than you are, but you might have heard that already. But let me add some other corollaries to this. If you go out on a date, then your date was on average on more dates than you have been. And if you're married, then on average, this is mathematically true, your spouse has been married more times than you have. So there are several non-trivial corollaries that come with this mathematical trickery. Let's go back to our systems, and I'll soon make a brief stop for questions. So we've shown this for ecological systems, but the idea is this: you go to beta space, you expose a hidden universality. So systems may seem diverse and unpredictable because they're multidimensional. You're perturbing them in all sorts of different ways. But once you map them to beta space, you find that all of this diversity collapses into a universal behavior. Okay, so we have different systems here, and they all undergo an abrupt transition and at very unpredictable points. But once we map them to beta space, we can predict the critical transitions of resilience loss between them, and everything collapses into one universal curve. So where's the physics behind this? And with this, we're pretty much going to complete the first part of our presentation. Let's go back to our kettle. You see, no two kettles of water are identical. If we look at the microscopic description of a water kettle, there are so many degrees of freedom. Every water kettle has millions of molecules, and these molecules can be all over the place. And there's no way to predict what each molecule will do. In fact, no two kettles in the history of the universe had the exact same configuration of molecules. So the microscopic states are extremely diverse and unpredictable. On the other hand, the transition between liquid and gas is extremely predictable, and it always happens at 100 degrees. What's the trick? The trick is this: that despite the fact that the system is characterized by millions of microscopic parameters, there is only one macroscopic parameter that matters, and that's temperature. And if this molecule suddenly got an energy boost and started moving faster, or that molecule suddenly lost energy or bounced into another molecule and stopped, that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is how these two microscopic changes impacted the one parameter, temperature. So this is not a mapping. It's not the same math, but it's the same idea. Beta effective is the natural control parameter in a network. And therefore, whenever you make changes to your network, by changing weights, changing nodes, and so on, what's important is not how it changed the average node. It's not what percentage of change you made. What matters is how these changes impacted beta effective. Because the whole behavior of a system, the temperature of the system, the one parameter that determines if it's going to be in the live state or the dead state, the biodiverse state or the multi-collapse state, or, I will add, and this is true, or in the pandemic state or the healthy state, it's not about the behavior of the average node. It's all about the behavior of the average neighborhood of a node. I think this is a good place to stop and collect some questions before I go on to our next part.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Baruch. I saw a question from Bnaya. You can ask.
Yeah. Baruch, I have a question. In the previous slide, you showed that the correct method is to look on the neighbors is not to choose randomly a node, but instead choose randomly a node and then look on his neighbors. So basically, you want to take into account the links themselves. So why not to choose randomly a link and take randomly the nodes around it? Basically, it will give you the same solution you need.
It's very similar. It's very similar. We don't choose randomly a node. We just calculate this for the network. So for a given degree distribution, I can actually construct what beta effective should look like. So we don't actually do the sampling process. We calculate this for every system. I'm not sure, maybe there's some details I didn't take into account, but I think that from a statistical point of view, choosing a link and then going to the node that relates to it is just like choosing a neighbor. So it's the same thing.
I see. Thank you.
You can also choose paths of 2 or 3 in a large enough network. It should be always the same. Yeah. So those things can be mapped to one another. I agree.
Any other question from someone? Okay, you may continue. No.
Okay, so we're right on time. I had a chance to look at my watch now, and it's fine. And whoever, we're going to start a different topic now. So it's going to be along similar lines. But if you kind of lost me in the last 10 minutes, or you dozed off, or I know your kids made some noise in the background, this is perfectly fine. You can join this part of the talk, and I think you'll feel that it doesn't rely on anything that we did before. We're going to ask now a more subtle question, because the previous question was on the macroscopic state of the system. Will the system be functional or will it collapse? Will the lights be on or will we have a big blackout? Will we have a pandemic or will it just decay and the majority of population remain healthy? Those are macroscopic observations on the state of the system. But the truth is that networks also do things that are much more subtle than that. And you'd like to predict that too. When the system is functional and everything is okay, still, what does the network do? So really, what do networks do? The first thing we need to do is formulate the question. So our framework is that we have a network, typically scale-free, weighted, heterogeneous, with all of the complexities that it has. That's the structure. On that network, we have different dynamic mechanisms that are captured by our three nonlinear functions, M0, M1, and M2. You couple them together, and you need to ask them a question. What do you do? So let's look at the different observations we have about networks. For instance, this blackout is a result of a local collapse somewhere in the system, which propagated through the network to impact everyone living in the New York area. This is a genetic experiment. People knock out genes, and they measure how that changes the activity of all other genes. They get information on how genes communicate with one another, how one gene impacts the activity of another gene. And this is, of course, the result of a local outbreak. So someone coughs in China, and within a few steps, this propagates to the rest of the world. I would argue that all of these examples have one thing in common when we look at their mathematics. They are all about patterns of information spread. Because if you're sitting in the dark in New York in 2003, what you've got is actually information. The fact that you have no light is information that spread from a local perturbation somewhere in Canada and propagated through a mechanism of overload failures. If a gene responds to the knockout of another gene, that's information that's carried through biochemical processes. And if you get corona in the coming days, that is information that's propagated through the social network in viral form. So the mechanisms are different. The spreading interaction is different between different systems. But what we really want to know is how everything we know from 20 years of understanding network structure leads to different patterns or predictable patterns of information spread. Mathematically speaking, we're now not looking at when the system collapses. We're looking at something much more subtle. The system remains in its functional state. It's at a steady state. Everything is good. And then at some point, there was a local perturbation that changed the activity of xj by delta xj. This generally, that can be like a protein that was suddenly overexpressed or someone getting infected by an epidemic. This perturbation generates a signal that starts impacting its neighbors and its next neighbors, and it starts traveling through the system until it elicits a response at some target node xi. And you can ask many questions about this signal response relationship. For instance, we can ask, how much time will it take the response to reach the target node? See, that's the initial signal, and it elicits a response in different nodes, and every node has a different response time because it has to travel different distances in the network, or maybe nodes also don't respond evenly to the signal. We can ask, where will the signal be observed at every given point in time? For instance, the signal in China is no longer observed in China. It's now observed mainly in Europe and the United States. So where will the signal, where is the mass of the signal be observed? We can ask a very crucial question, and that is, how strongly will the signal impact the node? Different nodes will respond differently to the signal propagating. So I started a signal delta xj, and the question is, what will be delta xi? If I wait enough time and measure the overall response, how strongly will it impact? If typically signals have a strong impact, the network is very good at spreading information. If typically signals have a very weak impact, I can perturb the system here and I don't observe anything here. The system is actually a very weak information spreader. The last question I can ask is how? How exactly does it look when the signal spreads through the system? Now, this is a very cryptic question, I know. If we'll have time, we'll get to it, and it'll make more sense later on. So I want to start with the first question, which is when? How much time would it take a signal to travel through the system? Now, I'll start the way I started earlier. I'll do it phenomenologically. And I know what you're saying. You're saying this is pretty simple, right? You perturb a node, you create a signal. First, the nearest neighbors will respond, then the next nearest neighbors, then the next nearest neighbors, and we'll see it kind of propagating like waves in a puddle, only through our network. The truth is that, as always, networks combined with nonlinear dynamics are a very unexpected thing. So what we did here is we took the exact same network. It's a scale-free network, and we embedded it in exactly the same way. But what we did is we changed the dynamics. This is, for instance, genetic dynamics. This is a model for brain dynamics. Here's the SIS model. You remember that for epidemic spreading. Here's our plant pollinator model. Here's a biochemical model. So we have the same network, the same layout, but different interaction mechanisms. And at t equals 0, we introduced the signal here at the center. And sometimes, let's look at the blue ones. Sometimes the colors will make sense later on. And sometimes the signal really does spread the way we would expect it. You see, it starts here at the center, then it impacts the neighborhood, and then it goes to the rest of the network. So it seems to go from inside out in a pretty predictable fashion, the way we would intuitively expect a network to spread a signal. But let's look at the red dynamics. In the red cases, the signal seems to, first of all, impact the periphery and only then collapse inside. That's a very counterintuitive form of spread. We wouldn't expect that. And the green dynamics is just another mess. I don't want to get into it right now. But what we see is, first of all, what we've seen also previously when it came to resilience, the ways that signal propagate in a network are not just determined by the network. Remember our traffic analogy? Similar networks, similar roadmaps, can lead to very different traffic patterns. Okay? This is all the same network, but once we change the dynamics, we see visibly different spreading patterns of signals. But let's be a little bit more specific than that, because that's like the macroscopic spread, and maybe not everyone sees in here what I see in here. So let's track two specific nodes, the same two specific nodes throughout the entire story. Gray and black. You see here, in these two dynamics, when I look at the response of gray and black, they seem to respond concurrently, simultaneously. It means that the signal reached gray and reached black at approximately the same rate and impacted them at approximately the same time. On the other hand, same signal, same two nodes, red and black, but this time, black responds 2 orders of magnitude slower than gray. It took the signal 100 times more time units to reach black instead of gray. But let's look at the green dynamics. That's interesting. Same two nodes, black and gray. Once again, we see this separation, but this time, black responds 2 orders of magnitude earlier than gray. So not only are the time scales all the way down from 10 to the negative 3 to 10 to the 3, 6 orders of magnitude difference in time scales exhibited by the exact same network. Not only are the time scales different, but even the naive question, who will receive the signal first and who will receive it second, which seems to be neighbors, next neighbors, and so on, seems to be determined by the network structure, even that becomes unpredictable once we combine nonlinear dynamics on our network. So at this point, what we know is that we have universality in network structure, in this case, same network, but we have extreme diversity and lack of predictability in network dynamics. Why? Because it's not all about the network. It's about the network and how it interplays with the nonlinear dynamics that occur between the nodes. But now, with this diversity, we want to do what we did before and kind of make it a little bit more universal. Kind of see that there is a rule behind the mess. And the idea is to forget for a second about the network. Now, how can I say that? That's like undermining everything we do, right? But let's do that anyhow. Let's forget for a second about the network. Let's just imagine 2 nodes in space, okay? And I introduced a signal at node J, and I impact its direct neighbor, node I. No network around here, just J and I. And I measure the response of I, and I find that this is the response time. This is how much time it took I to respond to J. So this doesn't have all the confounding factor of whether I is distant from J or close to J. It's a direct neighbor of J. okay? So we're looking at node i's individual response time. It really has to do with the question, how fast is node I? Is node I a fast responder or a very slow responder? And what we can show is that under the dynamics that we're looking at, tau I, the individual response time of node I, scales with that node's degree ki to the power theta. Now, why should you be excited about that? So in the next couple of slides, I'll try to peel that down layer by layer. First of all, where does theta come from? Okay, it's a scaling relationship, but where is that exponent theta coming from? So we need to do some convoluted math, and I'm not going to do it with you. I'm just going to show you what goes in. So this is not a cookbook. I'm not going to show you how to cook it. Just going to show you the ingredients. We start with our dynamic equation. We take some function, which is m1 divided by m0. Just believe me on that one. Then we take another function, which is the time, which is the spatial derivative of m1 times r. And we actually take the 1 over that, okay? And then we put into this function the inverse function of r, and we get some power series. And theta is determined by the leading power in this power series. At this point, all of you have lost me, which is perfectly fine. Here is the important thing. What goes into theta and what doesn't go into theta? So I need you concentrated now, okay? What goes into theta is m1 and m0, just the nonlinear functions. What doesn't go into theta is aij. The network doesn't matter. Theta, and here it is in yellow, theta depends strictly on the system's dynamics. So it kind of separates the contribution of dynamics from the contribution of the network. Theta depends strictly on the dynamic functions m0, m1, and m2. But here's another crucial point. It only depends on the leading powers in this power series expansion. Now, this might be a little bit complicated, but if you know how to divide functions, and if you know how to invert functions, and if you know how to take derivatives, you can calculate this. Whatever it is, you get some power series expansion, and theta only depends on the leading power. That means that it's not very sensitive to changes in the dynamics. It means that there might be very different dynamics, but if they happen to have the same leading power, they will have the same theta. That's another point. And the third point, and this again is a matter of scientific interpretation, is that when we look at this power series expansion, there is the powers, gamma, and there is the coefficients, c. I argue the following thing, that gamma depends on the structure of your functions. It depends on the interaction mechanisms. You cannot change that too much. On the other hand, well, they depend on specific parameters. So what I'm saying is that, while gamma is universal and is intrinsic to the dynamics of the system, the coefficients, well, you heat up the system, you cool it down, you add some sugar or deprive it of glucose, you're going to get different coefficients. Unfortunately, theta doesn't depend on that. These three characteristics, when put together, tell us that theta is a very insensitive parameter. Basically, in physical worlds, theta is a universal exponent. It doesn't depend on specific details. It doesn't depend on fine-tuning things in the network. It really is a characteristic of your dynamical system. There's also another side to it. If theta only depends on m0, m1, and m2, it means that once we measure it, we can gain some information on these. I'll put that aside for another talk when we meet next time face-to-face. But that's another challenge. Sometimes the dynamics are hidden from us. We don't know what are the interaction mechanisms in the system. And theta is some fingerprint. If we can measure it, we can extract information on the dynamics in the system. But I want to focus on this, on the universality aspect. Universality means that what looked diverse and unpredictable early on is because we didn't look at it through the right lens. Now we have theta and we can start making this diversity make sense. Also, the colors are now going to make sense. You see, the blue dynamics belong to the theta equals 0 class. And we can see that tau I is fully independent of a node's weighted degree, Si. We ran it on several different networks. We keep on getting the same result because theta doesn't depend on the network. It's an intrinsic characteristic of the system's dynamics. The red cases are the cases where theta is greater than 0. This is the case theta equals 3/2. This is the case theta equals 1. And we can see that this scaling relationship, again, is sustained even though we use many different networks, but always the same dynamics. And here's the last one. The green dynamics belong to the theta equals -1 universality class. And here's an interesting thing. You see, both of them belong to the same class. They both feature theta equals -1, even though they're very different systems. This is an epidemic spreading model, and this is an ecological model. They're not at all the same, but this is the point of universality. Theta doesn't care about many of the details. So basically what it does is this, and especially for the non-physicists, this is a good place to kind of listen in. When we look at the dynamics naively, what you see on the left, we find a whole mess, diverse and unpredictable. What theta allows us to do is show that this mess actually condenses into discrete boxes. So dynamics can be all over the place, but when we look at them through theta, we find that they belong to specific groups. And within each group, we have predictable and similar behavior. So networks tend to have similar structures. Once we implement dynamics, we tend to get diversity, but fortunately for us, this diversity is not all over the place. There are specific boxes, what we call in physics universality classes, that determine how the system can actually behave. But let's take this a step further, because universality is something that physicists are very excited about, but not necessarily everyone in network science. I would like to argue that theta answers precisely the question that we asked originally. You see, Ki is a structural feature. It's a nodes weighted degree. And it's a known topological element. And we have been mapping networks for 20 years, as I said. So we have a pretty good understanding of what is the behavior of nodes degrees. Tau I, on the other hand, a node's intrinsic response time, is a dynamic observable that we would really want to predict. It's not about structure, it's about the system's behavior. And theta allows us to connect between the two. It helps us map a well-known topological element into a desirable dynamic function of interest. We call this a dynamic determinant. So for example, if theta equals 1, it means that hubs are typically slower than low nodes. So the network gives you the degrees. This might be 10 times more, you might be 10 times more connected than I am, but if theta equals 1, it means that you're also 10 times slower. It takes you 10 times more to respond to an incoming signal. If theta equals 2, it means that if you're 10 times more connected than I am, you're 100 times slower. But interestingly, if theta equals, say, -2, it's the other way around. Now you're 10 times more connected than I am, but you're going to be 100 times faster because your response time is going to be inversely dependent on degree. So the network structure is always the same, but the way this structure translates into dynamic behavior depends on what we can predict is the exponent theta. Let's make this come to life, because up until now we're talking about individual nodes. What happens when we put this all back into the network? So remember our analogy with the network as the roadmap and the dynamics as the traffic patterns? That was a metaphor, but now I want to use this metaphor in reality. Let us imagine that the network is a roadmap, and that the signals propagating between nodes in this roadmap are like cars traveling between destinations. So when theta is positive, what we find is that the hubs, the high degree nodes, have a much slower response time. They are the bottlenecks for signal propagation. So in the theta positive regime, a signal from S will reach Y much later than X because of the hubs it has on the way. They're traffic jams. They take an infinite amount of time to respond. And this way, we see two nodes, both at the same distance. They're both third neighbors of the original signal, but one of them will respond much earlier than the other because it has a freeway. This one has traffic jams. But here's the fascinating point. Let's look at the exact same network element, the exact same roadmap, but now change the dynamics. If we look at the family of dynamics where theta is negative, theta equals -1, or theta generally smaller than 0, now the hubs are actually the fastest responders. So on the exact same network, all of a sudden, the upper path becomes the traffic jam, and the bottom path becomes the freeway. The question of which will respond first, X or Y, depends on context, of course. So what we have here is essentially a network GPS, because what does a GPS do? It takes your static roadmap, And then it tells you how much time it will take you to reach between destinations, because it assigns every component along the way a specific time lag. You see, what we did here is we used a naive layout. A layout which pretty much puts your neighbors next to you, and your next neighbors, and your next neighbors, and so on, as much as you can. So that naive layout was very unpredictable, because that's not the way to predict the spread. We can use our GPS to actually map the distance between nodes in a way that captures which ones are traffic jams and which ones are freeways. And the idea with this GPS prediction, this GPS layout, is that now what seemed diverse and unpredictable actually does look like the spread of waves in a puddle of water, for instance. Okay? So in that sense, we can now lay out the nodes. But here's the important thing. Most network metrics, most layouts, they fully depend on
GPS 不是，它是 network 的什么 science。
Someone needs to mute their computer. I'm sorry.
Amina, please mute.
Okay, so the important point is this. There are many different metrics to assign a distance between nodes. The path length, the minimum path length, and so on. All of them are completely structural. For every network, they give the exact same prediction. But this GPS prediction actually takes into account the dynamics. In the case where theta is positive and hubs are bottlenecks, it puts the pathways that are enriched with hubs in the outskirts of the network. And in the case where theta is negative and the hubs behave like freeways, they are the ones that actually expedite the flow of signals, it puts the pathways enriched with hubs more close to the core. So it changes the layout depending on the actual predicted dynamics, just like a GPS might give you a different prediction on the same roadmap, depending on the time of day. But let's go macroscopic, back again. I mean, how can we observe this even if we don't have access to every specific response time of a node? So one of the classic questions that we ask ourselves in network science is that we see the pervasiveness of the scale-free phenomena. We know that hubs are extremely heterogeneous, and we ask ourselves, what are the implications? What does that actually tell us about the behavior of the system? The naive approach, I don't want to say naive, the structural approach, okay, and the one that was covered yesterday, probably in Ruben's talk, is that what hubs do is that they make everyone closer. They reduce the length of pathways in the system because they're like shortcuts in the system. But that doesn't mean that they make signals propagate faster. Because remember, when theta is greater than 0, hubs dramatically slow down the propagation. We see here an Erdős-Rényi network and a scale-free network, and the scale-free network is much slower to respond on average than the Erdős-Rényi network. On the other end of the spectrum, when theta is smaller than 0, suddenly the hubs are the freeways, so they dramatically speed up the propagation. So notice that. It's the same structural characteristic, the scale-free degree distribution. The same structural characteristic can have profoundly different dynamic implications depending on which class you belong to, from being ultra-slow to being ultra-fast. And here's an interesting prediction that comes out of that. We can show that when theta is positive, the average response time scales with system size, like n to the power alpha. This is very peculiar because a scale-free network is as different from a lattice as you can imagine. In lattices, distances are typically very large. In a two-dimensional lattice, they go like n to the power 1/2. And in scale-free networks, the distances are vastly diminished of the system. But still, when we look at scale-free networks under the theta positive regime, they behave like a two-dimensional lattice. It seems that passing messages in this dynamics in a scale-free network is like passing messages in the classroom. You have to pass through all the distance of the classroom. On the other hand, there is another very, very counterintuitive form of spread in the ultra-fast regime. When theta is negative, the signals propagate so rapidly that it really only depends on how much time it takes the target node to respond. Everything along the way is enriched with hubs, and it's very, very fast. And what you find is that the amount of time it takes a signal to propagate and cover the entire system is independent of system size. Okay, so what we see here are networks that scale over 4 orders of magnitude But the amount of time it took for information to sweep the network is roughly constant. Here it's exactly constant, and here it goes somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5. Networks that have 4 orders of magnitude, but the signals cover them practically instantaneously, independent of system size. Here's another application. What happens if you lock down a node? You can do that by creating a very strong community structure, like a brain. And you can ask, how much time will it take signals to go from one community to another community? Very relevant these days. And once again, we find that in the theta equals 0 regime, the communities are just roughly lagging by one another, because once the signal spills over to the next community, you start spreading there right away. But in the theta positive regime, there's a very strong separation. It takes 2 orders of magnitude time for the signal to spill over between one community and another community, because the hub in the middle is a bottleneck. And it stops the signal and confines them to within one community. In the green regime, the hub is actually a freeway. And what you find is that despite the fact that the structure is divided into communities, the dynamics doesn't see that at all. And both communities respond pretty much simultaneously. So once again, we have similar structural characteristics, in this case, a strong separation into 2 communities, but very different dynamic outcomes depending on which box, which universality class your system belongs to. I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to go to the final idea. So if you got a little bit tired, we have approximately 10 minutes left. And I think this is a very interesting idea that we have been contemplating, and it was published recently. And let me tell you what this made us think. You see, we've been looking at how signals propagate between a source node and eliciting a response at some target node. So I knock out a gene here, and I look at the response of some other gene there. But what did the other 20,000 genes in the human genome do in the process? What they did is they were not the source of the information, and they were not the target of the information. They were the mediators. Most of the time in a network, what a node does is it's a pipeline. It moves signals from one node to another node. And therefore, if you really want to understand the role of a network component, we need to ask, how is this network component good at mediating information, rather than what's the impact as a source of information, or what's its response as a target of information. So we can look at the flow of a node. How effective is each node in transferring information? We can look at the flow of a link. How effective is each link? Or we can even go further and look at a pathway. How much is this, what fraction of information that spreads through the network actually passes through this pathway? Now, it's very subtle how to do that. I mean, the naive approach would say, look at how information spreads with that node, and then look at how information spreads without that node. So you can take that node out. That seems reasonable. The problem is that taking a node out is itself a very big perturbation. It generates a new signal. So you don't want to do that. What you want to know is how information spreads with that node responding, and how it spreads when that node is frozen. Let me give you a little bit of intuition. You see, N is a source of information, M is a target of information. And that information spread through all the pathways, the red and the blue pathway, they all spread information from N to M. If you want to know how much information spread through the blue pathway, you just want to block that pathway. You don't want to remove node I, you just want to not allow node I to respond. So it's a shock absorber. The information reached node I, but it didn't go further. This allows you to freeze node I and keep it there, but just lose its ability to mediate information. And now this is going to go very rapidly, because you know the drill. We start phenomenologically. We took a whole set of real, empirical, and model networks, and we introduced different dynamics on them, and we perturbed them. And we looked at how much each node and each link contribute to the spread of information. Once again, we find that it's visibly different. There's a zoo of information flow patterns. Sometimes it seems that roughly all the nodes participate in mediating information. That would be a democratic system. In other cases, it seems that information is really concentrated on a small number of flow hubs They are responsible for 80 or 90% of all the information that flows in the system, and all the other nodes don't take part in that game. And you know what's going to come next. Of course, behind this diversity, there is universal behavior once we look at it through the right lens. What we can show is that the flow through a node and the flow through a link depend on network characteristics like the in degree and the out degree of the nodes, but also on these exponents, omega and psi. And now you know how to read this, right? The in and out degree of all nodes, the blue term, is a known, well-mapped topological element. The level of information flow through that node or through that link is a dynamic function that we would like to predict. And the exponents, omega and psi, are exactly what we want. They allow us to take network structure, degrees, degree distribution, weights, incoming degrees, outgoing degrees, and translate them into actual observable dynamic flow patterns. It means that all of this diversity should actually follow one universal function. Here is our prediction. Here is what we actually observe. And you find that all of the data here collapses into one universal curve, one for nodes and one for links. Sometimes the hubs are all the way up here. They are the flow hubs. Sorry, nodes is here. Sometimes the hubs are sent out to here. Sometimes in a similar network, the hubs will actually be down here, all depending on the value of omega in this dynamic system. But you want to make this come to life because at this point, you're tired of hearing me talk about math. So let's put all this and make it a little bit more intuitive. In a directed network, it's all very complicated. Let's talk about an undirected network. We find that in an undirected network, all of these behaviors can be condensed, as always, into three different classes. The first class, denoted here by red, is what we call centralized dynamics. This is where our intuition lies. It basically says that the hubs are the ones that control flow. So we have a small set of nodes, the hubs that are concentrated in the middle, that actually flow a macroscopic fraction of the information in the system. That's the intuitive approach. It's a dynamic class, but it behaves pretty much like we would expect a network to behave. Most of the information flows through the hubs. The green dynamics are actually the case where the system is completely oblivious of its degree distribution. It's a scale-free network, but the flow patterns are actually democratic. All the nodes pretty much contribute the same amount to the flow, regardless of the fact that their degrees are very different. So that's a very strong discrepancy between structure and actual dynamic behavior. But maybe the most fascinating class is what you see here in the blue. Hubs are concentrated in the middle, low degree nodes are concentrated in the periphery, and what you find here is decentralized flow patterns or peripheral flow patterns where information actually favors the long pathways that avoid the hubs. Now that's very counterintuitive. It comes from the math. We see it in actual simulations, but now we can also get a little bit of intuition on where it comes from. You see, what does it mean to mediate information? It's not about how good you are at spreading information. It's not about how good you are at receiving information. It's about two things. For a node to spread a signal, first of all, the signal has to reach that node. Then that node has to respond to the signal, and then it has to elicit a response in its neighboring node. So for you to be a good spreader of information, it's not enough to be able to impact your neighbors. You also need to be responsive to your incoming signals. Sometimes in the blue dynamic, so your mediation is a balance between how responsive you are versus how impactful you are on your surrounding. In these cases, the hubs are just very, very stable. They do not respond to incoming signals. So they're like shock absorbers. Not only do they not contribute to the spread of information, they actually stop the spread of information in the system. The information has to go around the hubs because they are not responsive. The intuitive thing, think about that. You go into a room with 1,000 people. Don't do that, not these days, but in general. You go into a room with 1,000 people and you want to spread a rumor. So you find this guy that has a girl, let's make it egalitarian. So you find this woman that has 1,000 friends and you say, oh, I'm going to whisper on her ear. She's going to spread the message. Okay, that seems like a very good approach, but it doesn't always work because while you're spreading on her ear, there are 1,000 other people spreading on her ear. So yes, she might be a very good spreader, but she might not be very responsive. It might be very hard to cause her to actually spread your signal. So in some cases, hubs are shock absorbers rather than very influential spreaders in the system. And I'd like to end this with a biological example. We decided to actually test this on a real system. What do you mean a real system? Everything here was real systems. We used model dynamics, and we made some guesses along the way, of course. But here is a small network for metabolism. It's called glycolysis. It's what you're all going to do after this talk. You're going to eat lunch, and you're going to, okay, it depends on your time zone, actually. But a lot of you are going to employ this metabolic network at some point today, okay? And it turns glucose, which biologists believe looks like a triangle, into ATP, which is roughly speaking your energy molecule, which biologists like to show as a pentagon. It's a pentagram. And along the way, there are all sorts of chemical reactions. As you can see, this is a more complicated network. It has 3- and 4-dimensional reactions, but that's not the point. The point is that this is a very well-mapped system, and the parameters are well-known, and the system is well-known, and the chemical reactions are well-known. So you can actually simulate this in a computer and get something which is very true to reality. And we decided to say, okay, let's imagine that we perturb glucose. So we create a signal. And we look at the target node, the ATP, how much that impacts your information. And we looked at the contribution of all the nodes, all the chemical reactants, and all the modules, all the chemical reactions. It's not exactly links here. It's more complicated than just links to the spread. And what we found was very interesting. Sometimes nodes had a positive contribution to the spread. But there were several reactants that actually had a negative contribution to the spread. And the same thing occurred for modules. So sometimes you froze a node, you didn't allow it to spread information, and what you found is actually more information spread through the system. So some nodes had a negative contribution to the flow of information. And in the beginning, we scratched our heads around this, and then it gave us some broader insight on what this might represent. Because what is metabolism? Metabolism is a regulatory process, okay? What does it actually mean to do? The one thing that strikes you here is that the mean flow, if you take the negative and the positive together, you get a mean flow of approximately 0. And I think that's what biology is all about, right? Because why do you need to have such complicated metabolic networks? Why do you need to have all of these scale-free structures? What does it contribute to? There are easier linear networks that can lead from glucose to ATP. You don't need all of this convoluted structure. But maybe the role of a network is not to spread information, but actually to absorb information, to actually be a buffer. Because what is biology all about? It's all about the fact that you take resources and translate them into things that you need. In this case, you take food and translate it into energy. But food is very fluctuative. You eat 3 meals a day. You might you might catch a mammoth today and eat a lot, but then starve for a week. So food is very perturbative. What biology is all about is making sure that the output is not perturbative. So even though food is fluctuating all over the place, energy consumption or energy distribution is conserved. The way to achieve that is by having your network being able to buffer information. A network which is a very efficient information spreader is a network which is very volatile. And in some cases, networks are designed to push the mean information flow to 0 so that the output, the response, is independent of input of the perturbation, and the network actually serves as a buffer or a shock absorber of information. So what's the bigger picture? I've shown you several examples, but the idea is that once we take topology and combine it with nonlinear interaction mechanisms, we get that the same structures can lead into very diverse behaviors. But that diversity condenses into boxes of universal, predictable behavior based on a set of dynamic determinants. I've shown you several of them. I've shown you theta, and I've shown you the flow. But we have now in our lab something like 9 or 10 different dynamic determinants. If you put them all together, you can really create a dictionary which takes network structure and dynamic mechanisms as input and provides you with dynamic predictions of the patterns of information spread as output. I'm happy to accept questions. I think we have several minutes left. Just before that, I, of course, have to thank the people in my lab who are actually doing the work. I get to speak about it. but they're the ones really doing the work. These days, we're working through Zoom, and we're focused a lot on the current challenge of the pandemic. And I have to say that all of my students really came through and somehow adapted to the new situation. And we try to keep as much as we can the productivity, even despite these challenges. Thank you very much.